Hello, welcome along to the home ground. David Bashir is my name. I'm with professional concert goer, Have Mosh Pit, Will Travel. Max Schiffman, welcome.
Great to see you, Bash, as always.
Yeah, how's it been on the circuit?
Well, look, November in Melbourne is always a special time for concerts, and so, you know, I've been talking about it on the pod, but in the space of 9 days, I managed to do Oasis, Metallica, AC/DC, and topped it off with Rufus Du Sol. So quite an intense period of time.
Intense. Now, are you ready to talk about the sports infrastructure?
I can speak about that too. And, you know, the Metallica concert, which I have to say was my favourite, was at Marvel Stadium. And we're here today with someone who was instrumental in making it come to fruition, Graeme Samuel.
Absolutely, Graeme Samuel, the only man to be on the AFL and NRL Commission. Graeme, welcome along.
Thank you very much, Bash.
And tell us about your life in football. I'm interested in your life in sport, but your life in the AFL, how did it start and what instigated it from your point of view to get involved?
Lindsay Fox asked me as an investment banker, I was with Macquarie Bank at the time, to do a bit of a review of St Kilda Football Club because it was in financial trouble. And in the course of that, we did a bit of work on the AFL itself. And then one Sunday morning, Lindsay rings me, he said, "Graeme, do you want to go on the VFL Commission?" I said, "Well, I suppose so." And he said, "Good." Bang, that was the end of the phone call. The next morning I went in and saw my colleagues at Macquarie and I said, "What the hell's the VFL Commission?" And they told me what it was and I said, "Now, who are all the clubs in the VFL?"
That's hilarious.
That's as much as I knew.
Yeah.
And then a little while later, there were the various interviews and I remember Ron Cook from Hawthorn saying to me, "Now, are you passionate about football?" I said, "Oh, of course I am. I'm very passionate. I support Melbourne Football Club." And he said, "Well, that's good. That's all I need to know." And I was appointed.
There you go.
Quite incredible. And it was an interesting era, right? This was sort of the late 80s, early 90s, and many of our listeners are probably a little bit younger than that and probably don't understand the history of some of the clubs in the AFL, but that was a real time of expansion, wasn't it? I mean, you had, firstly, it was Brisbane Bears, if I'm not mistaken, and you had West Coast, you had Sydney, all these clubs were sort of expanding at that time. So what was it like through that period where the VFL was starting to become a national brand?
It was both exciting but also incredibly challenging, and there was a very good reason because we were converting the VFL into an Australian Football League. And in doing that, the Commission, which had been appointed end of 1984, had no power. It was subject to the whims and fancies of all the clubs, and the clubs actually ruled the game still, even though they had this board of directors, if you like, called the Commission. And so the decisions that were made were not really made by the Commission itself. And frankly, the Commission wasn't happy with a number of the decisions that were made. So the first one, Sydney Swans had been sent before the Commission was formed up to Sydney, that was South Melbourne Football Club. What the AFL or the VFL then did was they sent their weakest team into the toughest market and managed it from Melbourne. Well, that seems to me to be absolutely ludicrous. The Commission comes into place and Jeffrey Edelson says, "I want to buy the Sydney Swans." So we then negotiated a range of issues concerning the licence fee. Frankly, I have no idea why we wanted to charge a licence fee. We should have just simply said anyone who wants to take it on, we'd welcome them. So we negotiate a licence fee. Meanwhile, we're getting strong information from various sources that Edelson was not the right person to be potentially the owner of a club. But so we went along to a meeting of the club board and it was the club presidents and the AFL Commission. We said we have two bids. One is from Jeffrey Edelson and the other is from another group headed by Basil Sellers. Our recommendation is to go the Basil Sellers route because we think it's a better group of people. And they said, no, there's $200,000 or $300,000 more available from Edelson. We'll take that, thank you. And they voted to do it. And so it was contrary to our wishes. Jack Hamilton then went into another room after the end of the discussion around the board table, and he phoned Edelson and he said, "Well, you've got the ownership." And he said, "It's not me." He said, "I haven't got any money for it." He said, "It's coming from a public company that I'm involved in called Westec." So that was the first sort of shock, if you like, that we suddenly realised what was going on. We'd already been forewarned by very senior people in the public service and elsewhere that he was not the right person. So it went on, and we had the helicopters and Leanne and all these sort of things that were occurring, and it was a lot of pizzazz, but it wasn't going to work. Then it basically went broke. Sydney wasn't going to continue, and we went through some extraordinary machinations to move it to another group of owners, of whom Mike Willesee, the TV interviewer, was one of the prime movers. I remember sitting with Ross Oakley at a discussion we had with these private owners, and Willesee fastened his eye on me and he started to ask serious questions. I thought, oh, gee, glad this isn't on TV, getting grilled. But it ultimately went to him, and when I say to him, to his group, and the chair was Peter Wynett. And what ultimately broke the whole mould of private ownership was a very interesting single event. Ross Oakley had said to me, would you go to Sydney one day and attend the pre-match lunch with a group of sponsors that they're trying to bring on board as sponsors of the Swans? So I went up there, and Peter Wynett got up and he said, well, I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of all my fellow owners. I just sat there and I held my head in my hands. I thought, this isn't going to work. How are you going to attract sponsors when you are talking about fellow owners? I went back to Ross. I said, Ross, we've got to change this. This is not going to work, this private ownership. Now, in the meantime, we had been addressing the expansion of the league in Brisbane with the Brisbane Bears, as they then were.
Another colourful character involved there.
I'll come back to that. Well, so the Brisbane one was again interesting. We had two options. One was to locate them in a stadium to be built in Carrara near the Gold Coast, and the other was to locate them at QE2, which was the big stadium up in Brisbane. And the preference of the Commission was to adopt the Brisbane option. We figured that it was better to be located in the centre of the population rather than in that what I call seasonal population of the Gold Coast. Seasonal because Melbourne people went up there, for the winter, the Melbourne winter, and then came back through summer. But unfortunately, the clubs, then led by who was it? Alan Aylett. Ran an action that said, no, we've got to give this to the group that Aylett was representing, and they outvoted the Commission by, I think it was by one vote. And then, of course, Alan Aylett revealed that it was Christopher Skase that was behind it. It was Paul Cronin was the front person, but it was Christopher Skase behind it.
Yeah, and they were colourful times in the AFL. So what was the turning point of the Commission becoming a greater force, a more independent voice, and primarily the moving force behind the AFL?
So in the early 1990s, three clubs, and they were Collingwood, Footscray and Hawthorn, were agitating for a review of the Commission. And Oakley, Scanlon and myself sat down and we thought, let's have this, let's have the review, we'll ask for it, we'll demand it. And we put up a suggestion, which was David Crawford. Now, David had done the previous review for the government of soccer. And so we called for the review and we recommended David Crawford, and they all agreed. And I thought to myself, they know what they're doing, because we knew exactly what Crawford would recommend. And he came back in 1992, I think it was, with this recommendation. He said, look, the AFL has to be restructured in the sense that the Commission is the board of directors, the clubs are the shareholders, the clubs will have two powers. One is to appoint and remove the directors, the commissioners, and the other is to admit or remove members, that is, the clubs. And the clubs had no choice, they adopted it. And so all of a sudden the Commission then had the power to do things. I have to say before that, the power of the Commission was limited to, for example, no project could they spend money on worth more than $100,000. So all we did was, if we had a $300,000 project, we split it into three. They had three sort of sub-projects for $100,000 each, the only way to do it. Bob Ansep, God bless him, the great marketer, wouldn't let us spend $150,000 on marketing the AFL.
Right.
It was just extraordinary.
Yeah.
So we had these sort of things, but suddenly then the Commission was in charge and it started to do things the way it wanted to.
Graeme, Max and I have spoken a lot about Waverley, the move to Docklands and so forth, but you were the prime mover in that respect. Tell us about the way that transpired, the thinking around where it's positioned now and some of the alternatives at the time.
Tom Reynolds and Mark Burrell approached me. I was then chairman of the Melbourne Olympic Parks Trust, and they said, we want to build a rectangular stadium for rugby league in Melbourne, and Melbourne Olympic Park seems to be the right place. So I said, all right, leave it with me. I went away and I thought about it, and I went back to them. I said, what if we can build this stadium at no cost to the government with a movable roof, retractable roof? And they said, it's not possible. I said, yes, it is, but you'll have to agree one thing, that is that it will be both an AFL and a league stadium. And they said, how do we do it? And I said, we'd have movable seats. And the movable seats are there, but they're rarely used. So Reynolds and Birrell said, okay, I agree, right? Then we went through a tortuous process of location. It was virtually impossible to put it down at Melbourne Park. We did even look at putting it over Swan Street and having Swan Street tunnelled underneath. It's the only way you could fit it in. But what broke it was there was a night when there was a Neil Diamond concert on it at Rod Laver Arena.
Were you in the mosh pit?
No, I wasn't. I was sitting in a corporate box.
That surprises me.
And the Neil Diamond concert, I have to say, is about the only popular music that I know and I love. So there was that, and then over at the MCG there was a Geelong football match. They both ended at the same time. Kennett and Stockdale and I were there at the Neil Diamond concert, and it took us an hour and a half at least to get out of the underground car park. I knew what was coming. Monday morning, first up, Kennett phones me and he says, Graeme, you're not putting the stadium down at Melbourne Park. And I agree. I said, it's not going to work. We then looked at the alternative locations. People talked of Waverley, no transport. Showgrounds, very limited public transport and all. The fundamental requirement was public transport, and there was only one other location, that was down at Docklands. So that's what we did. We did that, and then we negotiated a deal that involved Channel 7, the AFL putting a commitment to games down there, which gave it the revenue it needed to be able to sustain the financial investment, a builder, and a developer, which included a number of institutional investors, and that's what we did. And we ultimately agreed to do that. But when we announced the deal to the clubs, we got them on side by giving them $20 million, which is what Channel 7 had agreed for first and last rights to our future television rights. And then a little while after that, I spoke to the Premier, to Jeff Kennett. I said, look, Jeff, this is a boot scheme. It's called a build, own, operate, and then transfer back to government, so that the developer builds it, owns it, operates it for a number of years to get a return back on its investment, and then transfers it back to government for nothing. I said, do you really want that transfer back at the end of the period of time, which was 2027? And Jeff said, well, what do you got in mind? I said, what if I can get you $30 million up front now, cash, and it'll transfer in 2027 to the AFL? He said, is it a genuine arm's length calculation? I said, absolutely, I can prove it. And we got independent accountants to demonstrate it was fair. He said, I'll do it. And that's what we did. So we did that deal. The AFL said it'd pay $30 million. Stockland then tried it on and said, we'll pay $30 million for Waverley Park. And Wayne Jackson was then the CEO, and he said to me, what do you think? I said, it's utter rubbish. That Waverley Park is worth, I think, in excess of $100 million, and I showed him how by some sort of developer calculations. And I remember Gerard Healy and Ron Barassi on 3AW talking about Samuel's Inflation Park. Well, we ultimately sold it for $108 million to Mirvac.
I remember that, Inflation Park. What a line that was, eh?
Yeah.
It was a great line. And look, you talked about Melbourne Olympic Park, and you seem to have a knack of being on these boards or commissions at the most transformational periods. I'm not sure if it's causation or correlation, but that period for Melbourne Olympic Park, I mean, you saw the construction of John Cain Arena, you had the Glass House constructed. I mean, take us through what was going on there and how it's now become a world-class area.
Well, John Cain Arena was a very interesting development. Kennett said to me, we need a velodrome. And he said, it seems to me to be ideal to be putting it down at Melbourne Park. And so we had a bit of a look. And the problem with velodromes is that they've got to be fixed in place. You can't shift them. People talked about the matchbox model, where you would put a velodrome, as part of a stadium, and then you'd wheel it out. And but the problem is it loses its tuning. It has to be very finely tuned. And so it had to be fixed in place. And we were struggling trying to work out how to do it. And then the architect who had been advising us consistently on developments at Melbourne Park came and saw me one day and he said, I've got an idea. He said, but you've got to guarantee that I'll get the contract to develop to do the plans. And he said, will you guarantee it now? I said, I'll tell you what, show me what you've got in mind, and if it's good, then I'll guarantee you'll get the contract. He said, right, here it is. And he put it up on a whiteboard, and he said, what we'll do is we'll put the velodrome track in place, then we will put the seats over them, and they will crank up by pulleys to lift up out of the road and to expose the velodrome. I said, the contract's yours. I said, it's brilliant. It was just something we hadn't even thought of, and it was just a brilliant concept that he'd devised. So he did that and built what has now become the John Cain Arena. And the velodrome is sitting there, and it's a world-class velodrome. The glass house, gee whiz, these stories. So the glass house, so it's the old Olympic swimming pool. I sat in it one day with the then CEO of the Melbourne Olympic Parks Trust, Gareth James, and I'm not that tall, but I tried to fit my feet in and knees. The only way you could do it was turn on your side. There just wasn't the room. This built back for the Olympic Games, so people must have grown taller since then. Anyway, what happened was, I said, it's not going to work. It's no good. And I said, look, I think this could be a really interesting location for the administrative headquarters and for the training headquarters of a sports group. And so Gareth James said to me, so we'll try it on, see what you can do with the club. So I approached Richmond. They said they wouldn't cross Swan Street. I then approached St Kilda. They weren't going to leave their mud ground out at Moorabbin. I then approached Hawthorn. They weren't going to leave Waverley Park, which is where they were wanting to ensconce themselves. I then approached Melbourne, Joe Gutnick. No, he said, I've done a deal with Bruce Church whereby we're going to have our home ground at the MCG and train there. And I said, yeah, I wish you luck. I said, I can just imagine the groundkeepers of the MCG allowing you to train there during the middle of the week and wrecking their ground before the match is due. But I said, that's fine, you do it that way. And then one night I'm at a function and Eddie Maguire's there, and I said, oh, Eddie, I've had these bloody clubs. But I said, this is what we've got. We've got this terrific concept down there. We'll redevelop it. You'll have swimming pools and ice baths and training headquarters and everything else, and offices and the works. He said, well, you never approached me for Collingwood. I said, well, you'd never leave Victoria Park. He said, you want to bet? He said, I'll meet you down there tomorrow morning. So at 8 o'clock the next morning, we got down there. 30 minutes later, he shook my hand and he said, it's on, we'll do a deal. And it cost them $90,000 a year for rental. We developed it. We put the Victorian Institute of Sport in there as well. And then they had a playing ground up in Gosh's Paddock, which would be their training ground. And the only requirement was that we couldn't put a big fence around it. It had to be sort of available for the public, but they managed to deal with that. And that's how it happened. So, thank you to Eddie. He actually had the foresight to do it. And, we managed to produce what at that stage was probably the best training and administration facilities of any of the clubs in the AFL.
Yeah, it is. It's quite a unique precinct because of Collingwood's presence. Let's take away your ACCC chairmanship, because that took up a lot of your working life in between the AFL Commission and the NRL Commission. So how did you become an NRL Commissioner? I'm fascinated by this story.
Well, 2012, I've joined an investment bank, and this after the ACCC, and we have been hired by the NRL to negotiate their TV rights, which we did, and we got a very good result for them. Then what happened was John Grant, the chair of the NRL, approached me, and he met me down at the RACV club in Melbourne, and he said, I'd like you to join the NRL Commission, or the ARL Commission, right? And so I said, well, John, I have no idea why. I said, I know nothing about rugby league. And he said, yeah, but you knew nothing about AFL either, the game. He said, well, we want your experience in what you did with the AFL and to bring that to the NRL. I said, well, all right, I'm happy to give it a go. So I went in and spent 3 years with them, but it was fascinating. Almost every meeting I would say, look, we did this 20 years ago in the AFL, and this is how we did it. But they basically weren't prepared to adopt those sort of processes, primarily because the clubs were in charge, and the clubs just wouldn't have tolerated any of those changes. So come the end of the 3 years, and for a range of reasons, I was concerned about the ongoing governance of the NRL, and I remember saying sort of around Christmas Eve, before I was due for reappointment or re-election, I said, John Grant, look, I can't continue with this, I'm out. and Jeremy Sutcliffe, who was also on the NRL Commission at the same time, and he was, like me, a sort of a corporate person, said, look, I'm out too. He said, I don't want to be part of it. And we resigned.
Yeah, so one of the things that we've talked about a lot is the different structures around sports, and you oversaw that period in the AFL where it transitioned from that sort of private ownership / hybrid model into being effectively the member or key association led model. So what do you think other sports can learn from that? We talk a lot about soccer on this podcast, football, and they've had a lot of challenges with ownership and the FA model, the federated model. So, if you were advising another sport wearing your sort of corporate raider hat or corporate governance hat, how would you be telling them to go about making sure their sports remained successful and could thrive into the future?
It's a bit hard to translate the whole of what the AFL did to other sports because, the AFL is an intensely passionate, driven sport. It's got hundreds of thousands of members, and when you see the sort of the attendance at games like, well, we had attendances in the past year of at home and away games of 80,000 plus. So it's incredibly different from say NRL or other sports. The one that I see as having the greatest similarity is probably cricket, because cricket has really picked up in terms of being supported by a passionate group of people. When you can have the Perth Stadium totally sold out for, well, it was for 3 or 4 days. It turned out to be 2 days. You can't get tickets to Sydney. It's almost impossible to get tickets in Melbourne and in Adelaide. We're going over to Adelaide for 3 days. But I hope it's a 3-day test at the time. But, it's become quite passionate now. But the only thing I pick up with cricket is that it is run by a body which is a federation, and they are representatives of each of the states. And that, I think, is never going to work properly. If I was to say anything about sort of governance, I think that the AFL governance model has really set itself above virtually any other sport. So, it goes back to the David Crawford report, and, a lot of admiration for David, and God bless him, unfortunately he died recently, but he basically said, treat sport in governance terms like any other company. A board of directors, call them a commission or whatever you want, elected primarily on the basis of their expertise and their independence and the fact that they're prepared to look at the sport and its development objectively and in commercial terms, right? But at the same time, keeping the passion of the sport, very important. This is something we did at the AFL when we did the original report. Colin Carter did the so-called Blue Book. He said, never forget that there's so much passion attached to football. Now, what we've got to do is to introduce now the commercial elements into it to ensure it's got financial sustainability.
The AFL have earned the right to have a top-down funding model because they get so much from the media rights. Obviously, the media rights still drives the sport commercially, or part of. So what would you say, just further to Max's question, to sports that don't have the ability to attract that type of media dollar into the gate? Do they have to look outside the box? Have you thought about models that don't involve that type of commercial clout?
Look, not really. I mean, we're seeing, as I said, cricket, I think, is starting to get that commercial clout. Tennis has got it. Although there's been questions raised about the governance model of tennis, and we've seen some ructions there over recent times. I used to deal with Jeff Pollard when he was president of Tennis Australia, and you could see some of the complexities involved, in the way that was being run. Now, Jane Herdlicker has been involved, since, and but there's a lot to be said for, having both a combination of commercial and sport experience governing a sporting organisation, so that what they're doing is they're saying the sporting experience is there to provide the passion, to provide the rules of the game, if you like, the way it should be conducted, and then the commercial experience is there to do what we did with the AFL. Now, you've got to remember, when the AFL Commission was set up in 1984, the net assets of the whole competition, all the clubs and the AFL, including the valuation on Waverley, was $3 million. That was the net value. Now,
that's a median house in Sydney almost.
It was extraordinary. Now, once we had done the deal with Colonial Stadium, the net assets of the league then measured probably $750 million. That's the change. But that was commercial, introducing commercial concepts and commercial sustainability into the operation. And, it seems to me that that's pretty fundamental. If you haven't got commercial sustainability, financial sustainability, then the sport itself is going to suffer.
Well, I think the other thing that really stands out for me with the AFL is how it's managed to not only run that really sort of hard-nosed commercial growth, but also balance it with the grassroots part of the sport as well. Like, it does such a great job of working with kids trying to get into sport and foster pathways. So, what was it like trying to balance those two things at the time?
Well, you've got to remember that my role was to be commercial. And in fact, Mike Sheehan used to do every year a sort of a league table of the most influential people in the AFL, and he'd rank me either one or two, but he always used to say that whenever they got to discuss football around the commission table, I'd pull out my BlackBerry and start doing some work because I didn't understand it.
You were the faceless man, weren't you, behind the scenes?
But it didn't matter because Ross Oakley and Wayne Jackson knew that people like Jeffrey Brown, who wasn't on the commission, who was our legal advisor, and myself, Peter Scanlon, were the commercial people. They were going to bring about financial sustainability, and then there were others around the table who were there to bring the, if you like, the passion and the passion for the game into the mix. People like Bill Kelty, Colin Carter, very important. People from South Australia, Hammond and others were, they were really important to be able to do just that. So it was a very good mix of expertise and of passions and of drive. And it didn't matter. Look, I didn't understand much of the game at all, I can tell you. I remember sitting there with Yabby Jeans one day at a game, and he pointed to something on the ground. Oh, he said, wasn't that a brilliant play? I said, oh, yeah. I said, it was really... I thought, God, don't ask me what it was. I had no idea. But I don't mind admitting that. I mean, it was well known that I was not, passionate about what was happening on the field. Now I watch it and I think, my grandson could be a better coach than whoever's coaching that team for seeing some of the things that are happening. But I mean, it's those sort of things, and But if you can provide that objective commercial input, then that's leads ultimately to sustainability, and it's enabled the AFL to keep the clubs going. The clubs now are just extraordinarily, right across the board, extraordinarily well-heeled and stable financially, and that's been very important. It means they're all there.
You mentioned passion, the tribalism. What would you say to Tasmanians now who are in a quandary because obviously their licence in the AFL is subject to the Macquarie Point Stadium being developed, and that is, I'm not saying that's teetering, but obviously there's a big debate pro and negative towards that stadium. Would you say to the Tasmanians have a bigger picture look in 10 years' time in looking at the argument? Yeah,
look, I'm not entirely familiar with what's proposed with the stadium, the development, but I do get a sense that in a way it mirrors what we did with Docklands. You've got to remember at Docklands we had a dust bowl, railway lines and nothing else. But the stadium became the grain of sand that developed into the pearl of Docklands. And I'm guessing with a little bit of knowledge about what they've got down there, that's exactly what could happen with the AFL stadium, the football stadium down there. It'll become the grain of sand around which there could be a significant development, which will be tremendous for Hobart and for Tasmania. Add to that the fundamental imperative that Tasmania has to become a team in the AFL. I mean, it is so important. So, not that any Tasmanian politicians are ever going to listen to me, but I would say to them, look at it in a broader sense, not just as the building of a stadium. Look, when we built the Colonial Stadium back in what was it, started in 1997, I mean, people must have thought we were absolutely raving mad to be putting it down there and everything else. We had other ideas. There was an idea there was going to be the racetrack for the Grand Prix and all this sort of stuff. But ultimately, it was around that stadium that we got the whole development of Docklands. And it's been very important.
Yeah. Well, Graeme, it's been fascinating hearing your story. I'm sure, Max, you'd have a million property questions to ask Graeme.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we didn't even touch on some of the other stuff that you've done in terms of advising government. and maybe one day they'll listen to some of your good ideas.
Well, I'm hoping desperately that the environment review, which we did back in 2020, will actually become law. We'll have to wait and see, but there's a lot of discussion going on about that. And if that becomes law, then that's a massive step forward. I'd have to say that's probably the biggest review I've done, and the one that's probably going to prove to be the most important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Graeme, thanks for your time on the home ground.
Good to be with you.